Hola mi gente, it's MsMalcolmHughes here, coming to give you my final book review of 2020, and that will be the 1619 Project from the New York Times. The 1619 Project is an endeavor that the New York Times embarked upon in order to rewrite America's history, not from the story that we know with Independence Day and the Founding Fathers, but from the year 1619, which is the first year that slaves are recorded as being brought onto these shores, and the place in which that happened is Virginia. So the 1619 Project starts there. That's the synopsis that you need. It's attempting to tell a more accurate depiction of America's history without leaving out the parts that are often overlooked, shunned, or brushed over, which is how deeply slavery has impacted this country from inception to modern day. So the 1619 has a number of articles. There is two parts that come with it. You get the magazine, you also get the newspaper. Mine is framed and hanging up, but you've seen it before. So it has the newspaper, you'll see the clip here. So what I loved about this, just beyond the idea and the actual creation, is that it tells so many different stories and it has so many different writers that there is a style of writing for everyone. There are some authors that I prefer their style of writing to others, but what that doesn't take away from in any way, shape, or form is the brilliance therein. So for someone like me, someone who is a Black history buff, I've studied it since I was a young girl, whether it's in the home or just on my own. You know, you get a little bit of knowledge in school, right? But you don't get the full depth. And I remember when I was younger, we had learned about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X in school. And I remember there was so much on Martin Luther King, and I remember Malcolm X was brushed over. And I remember just really feeling drawn to him and his teachings, and going home and asking like my aunts and things about him, and they didn't really have a lot to say. So for me, that was what sparked me on my journey of like everything Black history. Looking into Malcolm X, it was just a snowball effect, because once you get that knowledge, you want more, and it's so intricate and interconnected. And just learning about Black history for me as a young girl, a young Black girl growing up on the west side of Chicago, it just opened so many possibilities and just taught me so much about who we were, who we could be, the desire. Like, it just, I cannot even begin to simplify and put into words how much that changed and shifted the trajectory of my life. And I think that that is something that's worthwhile noting here. And I say that to say, because for someone like me who has studied Black history for a very long time, and I feel like I have a good handle on it. Obviously, I don't know all, but I feel like I know a good amount. I learned things that I didn't know, or I learned nuances that I wasn't aware of. And I love the fact that it's across time. It starts with 1619. You learn that there were 20 or so odd enslaved people who were brought to this country, right? You learn that it's in Virginia. Virginia is always a tricky place for me because I live in the DMV area. And I remember when I first moved here, because in school you always hear about Virginia in association with slavery. And for me, when I moved here and realized like this is the Virginia, it's just so surreal and otherworldly. And sometimes when you're just walking through Virginia, and if you're really in tune, like you can just feel it and you can just imagine, and you see the woods and you see the trees and you see the swampland, and you're like, is this what my ancestors had to go through, right? Are these the same trees, right? Is this the same area? So it's always a very like spiritually heavy place for me. So to know that that's where the first enslaved humans arrived, it's just very symbolic. And I think that what this composition of pieces of writing does is it gives you a full breath. It gives you those dynamic moments of our history that are glorious, and you feel that pride. It also gives you those moments that are heartbreaking, and you hear these stories, right? So even modern day, reading about Katrina all over again, and remembering that time, and remembering how helpless I felt in Chicago, watching the news and watching it all play out, and how devastated it was, and just in my bedroom crying, right? So reading that here, and it's just so amazing to me sometimes. The resilience and beauty of Black people. There's a quote, and I'm gonna paraphrase it, just that for all that we've been through in this country, like, Black people have the right to burn all of this down, right? If we so desired and decided that's what we wanted to do. But the grace, right? The mercy to keep striving and actually trying to meet the ideals that America itself was founded upon and still has not met, right? Even though we were excluded in the inception of them and the creation of them, but understanding that this is for all of us, right? I will never not be amazed at the grace of Black people. I will never not be amazed by it. So I think this does a really good job of just showing across the decades, right? You start, it has slavery, but it has the stories of enslaved individuals and the lives that they still created, right? How they still strive. It talks honestly about the pain and suffering that they had to go through. It depicts vividly the lives that they've created regardless, right? Outside of that, the lives that they still created. But then also how even in creating that, right, how that was always taken away, how it was always stripped away, and how even to this day, I love the fact that it's always connected directly to modern day, and how none of the problems that you view today as isolated events are isolated. They're all interconnected. You want to talk about the wealth gap in America? Let's talk about slavery, right? Let's talk about how when Black Americans did set up their own communities and had these thriving networks, right, and supported each other, how white supremacists always came in and destroyed them, right? Let's talk about it. Let's talk about Reconstruction, right? And how, again, you have this government that isn't standing on its ideals, even if you have policies in place, right? And I think even looking at modern day, right, and this like administration, and just making those connections, right? You see the trends over time, how we'll make progress, right? And then folks who feel as if America is a country for white men, which is language that has been used, and you come in and it's stripped away. Those policies are stripped away, right? The troops that you have in place to enforce it and keep people in line, that's removed, right? So then you have these savages of like white supremacists who come in without any regard and know that there will be no repercussions, and take land and murder. And this is often overlooked when you want to talk about the wealth gap between Black and white families in America, right? Because you have a people who are continuously starting over, right? You have to be honest about this. And then you have to look at the supports that were in place, right? So, and then these are things that we've all heard, well, I won't say all, but these are things that we've learned about before. You are aware of the history, right? You know that it's there. And even just reading it again though, it's so infuriating. You cannot read this and not be infuriated, whether you know or you don't know. And I think that's great writing, but it's also devastatingly heartbreaking that so much is just reoccurring. But it's also beautiful in knowing that we continue to strive. As someone who has spent a great part of her life advocating for equity in education, seeing how that has played out over time, right? We come from a people who we are the only people in America's history that have been prohibited at one point in time from learning how to read or write, right? Because understanding the significance of what that means to educate the mind, right? Like, I love that quote from Tupac. I may not change the world, right? But I will spark the mind that will change the world, right? So just having that knowledge of what that means to keep a people mentally chained and limited, right? But our resilience to thrive and strive anyway, right? So it even talks about the criminal justice system, because you cannot talk about slavery and make a direct connection to the criminal justice system. You can't not do it. It's just there and it's obvious. And I really appreciate the emphasis that is placed on Angola. I appreciate so much the work of Brian Stevenson. Love him. So I love that he has an article that he's written here. There's so much good work being done, right? Even when you feel sometimes just exhausted of trying, the cycles that feel non-stop, right? But you remember the rich history you come from. So I love the fact that this ends with taking 4 students who've recently graduated from the law school at Howard University, which is the #1 law school for graduating Black attorneys, right? And I love that it goes and there's someone who researches their background and their genealogy and can direct it to someone who has been enslaved. And I love the fact that those recent graduates get to reflect on what that means to them, right? Because we're not that far removed from slavery. My grandmother's parents were sharecroppers who come from parents who were enslaved. It's not that long ago, right? So we have to be realistic about that. So I love the fact that the connection is made, that when you want to think of this as so far removed, it's not, right? When you want to think of the current state of the Black community in America as behind, and you want to place all these negative stereotypes, it's not true, right? And it's not true without the full context and full scope, because even with all the struggles, we are prevailing, right? We're still striving, even with the policies that are still in place today to limit the trajectory, right, of success, right? We didn't have the same trampolines, and what I mean by trampolines is the same policies in place, right? The GI Bill, we didn't have that, right? We weren't allowed full access, and still we strive and we prevail, right? I also love the fact that it was honest about, and you can connect it to current times, again, with the history of abuse that has happened to Black people in the like at the hands of medicine, right? So it does talk about the Tuskegee experiment. There's so much that I want to share here, but I also want you all to read it. And if you don't read it, I want you to go and research, right? Because just like for me, when I researched Malcolm X, it just opened a window in a world to so much knowledge, right? That fundamentally changed me, right? How I view the world and my understanding of the world and my place in the world. So even if you know the things that I'm talking about and you don't have an intention of picking up the 1619 Project, that it's beyond this magazine. They have curriculum. And if you look at the power of knowledge, right? Because there has been politicians who've attempted to get the curriculum thrown out, right? They still don't want this taught in school, but it's so important, because if a nation is to heal, right? And that's what we've been hearing a lot, right? If a nation is to heal and move forward, you have to. And we can look at other countries, because I don't like the fact that we often view things in isolation or ahistorically. This has happened in other places, not to the same degree, not the same situation, right? But the oppression and abuse of one people by another has happened. We've seen it. We've also seen countries acknowledge it, reconcile with it, grapple with it, right? Have it out in the open, right? Attempt to make amends with the people who were harmed, right? And move forward with a healing process. The healing cannot happen if you will not acknowledge that a wrong was done. And we have to tell the truth, and it has to happen on all levels. It should be happening in homes, but it also should be happening in our schools. It needs to. So kudos, definitely always kudos to the schools that have African American history curriculums, right? Kudos to the school districts who have it in place that you have to take certain classes before you can graduate from high school. Kudos to the folks who are doing it independently and ensuring that this history is integrated into the curriculum in general. But that's not something that's happening across the board in the US, and it needs to, right? Young and old alike need to understand our history, need to understand what we've done historically, what we haven't acknowledged, right? Because the people who do not understand their history are destined to repeat it. Nothing can change until you understand what you've done wrong. And I think that this does a really good job of highlighting, obviously it can't include everything, but highlighting the wrongs that were done, the history that has been excluded, and how current day circumstances are greatly impacted by it. So to grade this for me would be wrong. There's no reason to grade this. It is in of itself a necessity, right? You can't put a letter on something that's bigger than that. It was intended to be a shift and to create those conversations and that dialogue. And for that, it has succeeded, and I hope that it continues to do that. So I want all of you to read it, research it, look up some topics that are covered, and educate yourself if you don't know. There's no shame in not knowing, right? There is shame in knowing that you don't know and that you choose to then woefully remain ignorant. That's a problem. So I think that we should all try and strive to be more knowledgeable, to be aware, to make others aware, and to not turn a blind eye to injustice. And that's what I hope. I hope that we all walk away more knowledgeable and invigorated and reaffirmed that the road is not easy and it's never been easy, but it's worth it, and we have to keep pushing forward. And I know sometimes that's a burden, right? Because sometimes it's heavy to know that our ancestors went through all of this and we still got to keep going today, right? But we have to keep pushing, and we have to support each other. And there is beauty even when it seems like there's only darkness. We still found the light, right? There's no American culture without black people, and that's on period. Or Mary Had a Little Lamb. Either one. That's it. Like, you can stamp that. There's no American culture without black people. Period. So I think this is necessary in the steps to moving forward. And it won't be easy, and as we all know, it's obviously not happening overnight, but I think it was a necessary creation, a necessary reference point in order to move forward. So I think everyone should read it. I loved it. There were moments when I had to stop myself and pause from crying, because it's palpable when you feel it. So please check it out. The next video will be the books I'll be reading in January, and it will also announce a book giveaway that I'm doing, and you'll find out then how to enter. As always, I am MsMalcolmHughes, someone who believes that books are sometimes better than people, but I hope that we all keep striving to be better all the time. Until next time, peace and be kind. Also, for those of you inquiring, I do still have buttons, my MsMalcolmHughes pins, and the details on how to get those are below.